A single comment, one whispered insult, was all it took. When Camilla crossed the line and mocked the one woman Anne revered most, it triggered a reaction the palace didn't see coming. For the first time in decades, Princess Anne didn't just step back, she walked away. For months following Queen Elizabeth's passing, something had been quietly unraveling within the walls of Windsor. At first, it was imperceptible, an odd pause in conversation, a cold glance exchanged across the dinner table. But to those watching closely, the shift between Princess Anne and Queen Camilla was unmistakable. What had once been a fragile truce, held together by duty and formality, was now crumbling under the weight of unspoken resentment. And at the center of it all was a battle over memory, legacy, and the invisible crown left behind by the woman who had held the monarchy together for over 70 years. Since becoming queen consort, Camilla had moved swiftly, some say recklessly, to establish her authority. Where Anne valued silence and strength, Camilla preferred spectacle and subtle control. Royal engagements were now filtered through Camilla's growing court of advisors, and key traditions once fiercely guarded by Queen Elizabeth were slowly being replaced, or worse, abandoned. The public didn't notice at first, but Anne did. And she said nothing. At least, not yet. The tension finally spilled into public view at a royal charity banquet in early spring. Cameras caught Camilla and Anne seated far apart, an unusual arrangement given their roles. Throughout the evening, Anne remained tight-lipped, barely engaging. Camilla, on the other hand, seemed radiant, her laughter echoing too loudly, as if trying to prove something. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a simple case of differing personalities, but to those who understood the language of royalty, it was a warning sign. Behind closed doors, a different storm was brewing. Sources whispered of a private confrontation weeks before the banquet. Anne, fiercely protective of her mother's memory, had grown concerned about Camilla's dismissive comments in high-level meetings. Decisions that once required Anne's input were now being made unilaterally. When she asked why she was excluded, Camilla reportedly responded with a smile and said, "Well, that era died with your mother, didn't it? That wasn't just disrespect. That was war." But what truly triggered Anne's decision wasn't a formal confrontation. It was a quiet moment. A whispered remark made by Camilla during a casual conversation with palace aides, where she allegedly questioned the glorified martyrdom of Queen Elizabeth's reign. She called it overpraised and emotionally exhausting for the rest of us to follow. The words may not have been intended for Anne, but they traveled fast and they cut deep. Anne had spent her life walking in the shadow of her mother, not out of envy, but out of pride. She had upheld the legacy, honored the traditions, and sacrificed nearly every ounce of personal freedom to defend the institution. And now, watching it be mocked by someone who had clawed her way into the crown through scandal and survival? That was unforgivable. But it wasn't just what Camilla said, it was where she said it, and who heard it, that turned this into a full-blown royal detonation. Camilla thought she was safe behind closed doors. But her cruel comment about Queen Elizabeth, dismissive, mocking, and shockingly bold, was overheard. And the damage was instant. It happened in one of those hushed, off-the-record moments royal insiders know too well. Surrounded by a tight circle of confidants, ladies-in-waiting, a couple of favored courtiers, and one senior aide loyal to Camilla since her Duchess days, Camilla let her mask slip. They were gathered in one of the smaller drawing rooms of Windsor, far from the public eye, far from official scrutiny. It was supposed to be a casual conversation, but in the world of royalty, nothing is ever casual, especially when it involves the legacy of the late Queen Elizabeth II. A topic surfaced that Camilla had carefully tiptoed around in public for years, the pressure of living in Elizabeth's shadow. And then, with a dismissive wave of her hand, she said it. Not once, but several times. Elizabeth's reign, she remarked, was outdated showmanship, designed to entertain the public and preserve image rather than evolve the crown. One source claimed she even laughed while referring to the former queen's iconic appearances as theatrics for the cameras. The air in the room shifted instantly. Some nodded awkwardly. Others stayed silent. But one person in that room, a mid-level staff member connected closely with the queen's former personal team, was stunned. They didn't confront Camilla. They didn't dare. But they didn't stay silent either. Within hours, the remark had traveled through private channels and reached the ears of the one person who would never, under any circumstance, tolerate such disrespect: Princess Anne. What followed was silence not of peace, but of shock. Anne's reaction was not immediate rage. It was a deep, still freeze. Those closest to her described the moment as chilling. She was holding a teacup. When the news came, she didn't sip. She didn't speak. Her knuckles just went white. It wasn't the first time Anne had heard whispers of Camilla's subtle undermining of her mother's reign. There had been veiled statements at dinners, occasional remarks disguised as humor during private briefings. But this was different. This wasn't hearsay or suspicion, this was confirmation. And this time, the mask wasn't just slipping. It had shattered. It wasn't only about what was said. It was how Camilla said it. Those present described her tone as spiteful, almost gleeful. It wasn't grief, nor exhaustion. It was a calculated erasure of a legacy that had stood for nearly a century. And Anne knew instantly this wasn't just about a single insult. It was about rewriting history from the inside out. Camilla, when later confronted informally, waved it off. She called it a harmless comment taken out of context. But those who had been in that room knew better. And Anne? She didn't need to hear it from Camilla directly. She had heard enough from those who mattered, because while Camilla shrugged it off as harmless opinion, Anne knew something far deeper had broken, and she made a decision no one saw coming. While the palace moved on, as if nothing had happened, Anne quietly packed her things. No press release, no farewell, just a silent departure that sent shockwaves through Windsor's corridors. There was no grand confrontation, no public spectacle, just a deep and deafening silence that spoke louder than words. In the days following Camilla's insult, Princess Anne vanished from the spotlight. Her absence began subtly: one cancelled engagement, a missed public appearance, then another, and another. The royal calendar, once defined by her unwavering presence and punctuality, began to fracture. Behind the scenes, aides scrambled for explanations. But no official answers came. Not even Charles, her brother and now sovereign, seemed to fully grasp what was unraveling before his eyes. It wasn't until a grainy photograph leaked to the press that the world realized something far more serious was unfolding. A single shot of Anne's personal effects being quietly loaded into a car outside Windsor was enough to trigger a media frenzy. The Princess Royal had never been one for dramatics, yet this move felt deliberate, purposeful, and painfully final. For those inside the palace who had served her for decades, it was devastating. Staff members spoke of confusion, heartbreak, and a sense of betrayal. For them, Anne had been more than a royal. She had been a constant, a symbol of duty that never wavered. And now, without warning, she was gone. Charles, torn between the crown and the people closest to him, is said to have personally reached out. Behind closed doors, the conversation was brief, but heavy. He reportedly urged Anne to reconsider, to let it go, to remember the image they all swore to protect. But Anne's response cut through the diplomatic fog like a blade. "Some words cannot be unsaid," she told him. There was no anger in her voice, no theatrical sorrow, only resolve. She wasn't making a statement for the cameras. She was drawing a line no one else had dared to before. As word spread, public speculation exploded. Was this a protest? A resignation? Or something deeper? Then came the sightings of Anne alone at Balmoral, the place she had always associated with her mother, the place untouched by Camilla's presence. There, she found solace not in exile, but in clarity. The press couldn't contain the questions. Why now? Why so sudden? And most chillingly, what had truly been said to push the Queen's only daughter out of the very house her mother once ruled? The monarchy remained silent. No statements were issued. No attempts to clarify or control the narrative. But that only made the silence louder. Because behind the palace gates, it was no longer about protocol, it was about a reckoning long overdue. But if the palace hoped her absence would blow over, they were wrong, because Anne's next move would send an unmistakable message to Camilla and the entire monarchy. Princess Anne didn't just leave. She drew a line between the monarchy she swore to protect and the one Camilla was reshaping, and the public was quick to choose sides. It began quietly, as all royal revolutions do, not with a headline, but a carefully chosen phrase dropped into the middle of a routine charity appearance. Anne was standing before a room of dignitaries and military veterans when she delivered a remark that sent shockwaves through the monarchy. "True loyalty," she said with chilling precision, "isn't bound by titles, it's bound by legacy." There was no mention of Camilla, no overt defiance, but everyone knew. The message had been sent and received. At that moment, Anne transformed her silent withdrawal into a public stance, and the line in the royal sand was drawn. What followed was a reaction the palace was unprepared for. Social media ignited. Hashtags praising Anne trended for days. Thousands shared photos of her with the late queen, quoting her words, honoring her steadfastness. Royalists and Republicans alike found common ground in one sentiment. Anne represented the monarchy they could believe in. The quiet, resilient daughter of a woman who reigned with stoicism and honor had become a symbol of resistance to what many now called Camilla's court. Behind closed doors, the divide was more severe than anyone imagined. A silent civil war had taken root within the monarchy itself. On one side were those fiercely loyal to the memory of Queen Elizabeth, the traditionalists, the legacy keepers, the ones who had stood beside her for decades. On the other hand, Camilla's circle is newer, more image-driven, wielding soft power through influence and charm. Anne's statement exposed what had been bubbling beneath the surface. The crown was no longer united, it was fractured, and Camilla was now at the center of that fracture. What the public didn't see was the quiet support Anne received from the two people who mattered most in the royal line of succession, William and Catherine. Though they made no public comment, sources close to the family revealed that they had spoken privately with Anne in the days following her withdrawal. It was said that Catherine, who had always admired Anne's unwavering service, shared her growing discomfort with the palace's new direction. William, caught in a balancing act between loyalty to his father and concern for the institution's future, reportedly told Anne, "We see what you see. We're not blind." For King Charles, the fallout was devastating. Already strained from the pressures of his reign, he now found himself caught between two women who defined his life, his sister and his wife. He had always counted on Anne to be the steady hand beside him, the voice of reason when palace politics turned volatile. But now, that hand is gone, and the voice had turned against him. Anne's choice wasn't just personal, it was political, a rebuke of everything Camilla represented. And that choice was echoing loudly through every hallway in Windsor. Camilla, once confident in her growing authority, now found herself increasingly isolated. Senior courtiers began avoiding her meetings. Royal advisors reported frostier interactions. Even her once loyal allies seemed more cautious. The whispers grew bolder. The cold shoulders multiplied. And as Anne's influence rose in silence, Camilla's power began to erode. One uneasy smile at a time. And just when the media frenzy seemed to hit its peak, a long-lost royal letter resurfaced, revealing Queen Elizabeth's chilling final thoughts about Camilla. Locked away in Windsor's private archives was a letter Queen Elizabeth never intended for the public. But once revealed, it became clear she had seen this coming all along. The timing of its discovery couldn't have been more unsettling. Just as whispers of division between Anne and Camilla began to dominate headlines, a royal historian, tasked with organizing documents for the upcoming coronation exhibit, stumbled upon a sealed envelope marked with the Queen's personal crest. It was dated a few months before her death. Not filed through official channels, not copied to royal advisors, just one envelope, handwritten, addressed only with a single word: legacy. At first, the historian hesitated to open it. But upon alerting palace authorities, it was clear this wasn't an ordinary note. It was a ticking time bomb buried beneath layers of royal tradition. What the letter contained wasn't a direct condemnation. Queen Elizabeth was too calculated for that. But it was a warning, eloquent, razor-sharp, and cloaked in her signature restraint. "Guard the crown," she had written, "from vanity disguised as duty, and from those who seek comfort in power, rather than sacrifice in service." She never mentioned names, but the references were painfully clear. Her words echoed themes Anne had privately voiced for years about image taking precedence over substance, about respect being treated as performance rather than principle. The palace tried to keep the letter buried, but in a family already divided, secrets have a way of leaking. Anne, shown the letter in confidence, was reportedly overwhelmed with emotion. According to one close aide, she read it silently, hands trembling, before whispering, she knew. She always knew. For Anne, it wasn't just validation, it was vindication. All the pain, the silence, the loneliness of watching her mother's legacy be reshaped in front of her was now grounded in her mother's own words. This wasn't just Anne's fight anymore, it had become Elizabeth's posthumous stand. But the letter didn't just reach Anne. Eventually, it was shown to King Charles. What he felt in that moment remains largely unknown, but insiders described him as visibly shaken and profoundly heartbroken. The woman who had loved him unconditionally had left behind words that questioned the very foundations of the monarchy he now shared with Camilla. And though Elizabeth had never denied Charles the right to love who he wished, she had clearly drawn a boundary between personal affection and the burdens of the crown. A boundary Charles was now realizing he may have blurred too far. The implications of the letter stirred urgent debate among royal legal advisors. Was this a private reflection? Or had Elizabeth intended it to serve as an informal final testament guidance from beyond the grave? If so, what authority did it hold? Could it shape policy? Could it change titles? Could it force the palace to act? The lawyers argued. The advisors hesitated, but the court of public opinion had already made up its mind. The moment the letter's existence was hinted at in the press, a media storm erupted. Speculation soared. Commentators drew lines between Elizabeth's words and Camilla's recent conduct. And suddenly, Camilla's silence became deafening. She didn't address it. She didn't deny it. She didn't dare. Because with Elizabeth's handwriting now speaking louder than any crown or title, her shadow had returned, and this time, it wasn't fading. And while the letter shook the royal foundation, it was Anne's next public declaration that would erupt like a storm, and finally name names. She had stayed silent for too long. But now, with the monarchy on the line and her mother's memory tarnished, Princess Anne broke tradition and broke Camilla's illusion of control. No one expected it. Not from Anne. Not from the royal who had always embodied discretion, stoicism, and silent sacrifice. But something inside her had shifted. And once the Queen's letter surfaced, that silence turned into fire. Anne agreed to a televised interview, one-on-one, unfiltered and completely unprecedented. For a woman who had given decades of her life to upholding the mystique of the crown, it was a seismic betrayal of protocol. But this wasn't about optics anymore. It was about truth. The interview began gently, but it didn't stay that way. Anne spoke of her mother, of the burden she carried, the grace she maintained, the sacrifices no one ever saw. And then, her voice changed. The air in the room turned electric as she leaned in and uttered the words that would forever divide the royal family. "There has been a shift," she said, "in loyalty, in purpose, in what this institution stands for. And I cannot, in good conscience, remain quiet while legacies are repackaged for convenience and courtrooms become playgrounds for power." It wasn't just bold, it was an open indictment. And then came the line that would appear in headlines across the world. "I will not defend a crown that forgets who built it." It wasn't subtle, it wasn't diplomatic. It was a war. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, hashtags supporting Anne dominated social platforms. Prominent figures across politics, the arts, and even former Commonwealth leaders expressed solidarity with her stand. Newspapers declared it the Second Elizabethan Shock. Talk shows dissected every phrase. For the first time in years, Princess Anne wasn't just a respected figure. She was a voice of rebellion, wrapped in honor. But while the public praised her, the palace spiraled. Charles, already weathered by the mounting storm between his sister and his wife, reportedly broke down in private after watching the interview. According to one aide, he sat alone in his study for hours, rewatching Anne's words, staring into the past that now stood in opposition to his present. He knew this wasn't just about legacy, it was about identity. And the more Anne spoke, the more he was forced to reckon with the uncomfortable truth. His reign was being reshaped, not by public consensus, but by personal conflict. Camilla's reaction, however, was anything but reflective. Behind closed doors, she erupted. Sources described her as furious, unhinged, and humiliated. She demanded a public retraction, a statement from Buckingham Palace disavowing Anne's words. But none came. The press office, perhaps sensing the shifting tide, remained neutral. Charles, torn and fragile, offered no support. And Anne? She didn't flinch. No apology, no follow-up. Her message had landed, and she knew the ripples had only just begun. But Anne's stand wasn't just emotional, it was strategic, because behind the scenes, she had one final royal card to play. In a world ruled by titles and tradition, it was two women, Anne and Catherine, who quietly changed the game. Their alliance wasn't just personal, it was historic. Long before the public clash between Anne and Camilla took center stage, something was already shifting behind the scenes. Hidden from the cameras, away from royal engagements and public appearances, a private meeting unfolded in the quiet rooms of Sandringham. It was there that Princess Anne met with Catherine, not as royal representatives, but as daughters, mothers, and guardians of a legacy they both feared was slipping away. What was said in that meeting has never been officially confirmed, but what followed left little doubt that the foundation of the monarchy was being realigned from within. Anne, the embodiment of her mother's strength and resolve, came bearing more than words. She handed Catherine a small velvet case containing a brooch once worn by Princess Diana. But it wasn't just an heirloom. It was a message, a quiet, symbolic gesture that placed Catherine at the center of a movement that had no throne, no crown, but carried the weight of generations. Weeks later, Catherine wore the brooch at a subdued Veterans Memorial event. No announcement was made, no questions were answered, but those who knew the stories saw it clearly. A line of succession, not of blood, but of belief. The pact between Anne and Catherine wasn't forged in rebellion, it was crafted in remembrance. They agreed on one shared mission, to uphold the values Queen Elizabeth had embodied: duty, discretion, and dignity, and to pull the monarchy back from the brink of vanity and spectacle. In private, they coordinated efforts, subtly reinforcing their presence in engagements that emphasized service over status. And when the press began speculating about Camilla's absence from several high-profile initiatives, no one from Anne or Catherine's camp stepped in to correct the record. Rumors soon surfaced that Anne had approached William, urging him to protect what's left of your mother's dream. The phrase struck deep. For William, who had watched his mother be consumed by the institution and now saw Camilla wielding the power she had once been denied, Anne's words were not just a warning, they were a call to action. Catherine, in turn, began quietly declining joint patronage, offers extended by Camilla's team. It was a strategic distancing, not publicized but impossible to ignore. Palace insiders described it as a graceful refusal that spoke volumes. The message was becoming clear. The future of the monarchy, if it was to survive, wouldn't be molded in Camilla's image. It would be shaped by those who remembered its roots, who respected the weight of the crown rather than the shine of it. Slowly, deliberately, a quiet coalition began forming around William and Catherine, not one of rebellion, but of preservation. The public didn't know the full extent of the alliance, but they could feel it. The shift in energy. The focus returned to the people, to service, to heritage. And for Camilla, the walls began to close in. Her influence, once secure, now felt questioned. Her initiatives stalled. Her proposals were sidelined, and while Anne and Catherine said nothing, their silence was loaded with strategy. But as Catherine rose quietly, Camilla grew louder until her desperation finally cracked, and she made a reckless move that changed everything. Cornered, exposed, and desperate to restore her image, Camilla went off script, and the entire monarchy watched in disbelief as it all unraveled live. It was supposed to be a dignified moment, a commemorative event marking a century-old royal tradition, an opportunity to reinforce stability, celebrate continuity, and remind the public that the crown still stood tall amid the recent turbulence. But instead, it became the epicenter of the most catastrophic royal misstep in decades. Camilla, already embattled by growing scrutiny and mounting isolation, took to the podium with a speech not approved by palace aides. In defiance of the carefully written remarks handed to her, she discarded the prepared script, looked up at the audience, and unleashed what would quickly be remembered as the monarchy's most shocking implosion in modern memory. Her words began as vague commentary, reflections on change, on new directions, and reimagining tradition. But within minutes, her tone sharpened. She spoke of misplaced nostalgia, of how the monarchy must move beyond idolatry of the past, and hinted that clinging too tightly to the old image of the crown was a weakness, not a strength. The temperature in the room dropped. The audience froze. But when she added coldly, and with unmistakable implication, that legacy is not immunity from critique, the message became chillingly clear. It was a veiled attack. On Queen Elizabeth, on everything she stood for, and on those who still carried her torch. There was an audible gasp. A ripple of disbelief cut through the ceremony like a blade. No one moved except one. Princess Anne, seated near the front, stood up in full view of the crowd, turned without hesitation, and walked out. Not a word, not a glance back. It was the most public act of defiance Windsor had witnessed since Diana's infamous interview. And yet, it wasn't loud or theatrical. It was surgical, symbolic, and absolutely devastating. Catherine remained seated, but her composure told a different story. Pale, visibly shaken, she stared forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't need to speak. Her silence said it all. For once, the woman known for grace and poise seemed rattled, as if realizing the storm was no longer theoretical. It was here, and it was turning royal tradition into chaos in real time. And then there was Charles. The king sat paralyzed. The words coming from his wife seemed to hit him like wave after wave, each one heavier than the last. As Camilla continued, oblivious to, or perhaps willfully ignoring the spiraling reactions around her, Charles didn't stop her. He didn't stand. He didn't defend. He simply stared. For a monarch whose every gesture had once been so carefully measured, this was the most damning response of all: total powerlessness. By the time Camilla stepped away from the microphone, the damage had already detonated across the internet. Clips of her remarks, Anne's walkout, and Charles's stunned silence went viral within hours. The monarchy's PR team scrambled to contain the fallout, but there was nothing to spin. The story had legs. It had emotion. It had a fracture. And more than anything, it had finally revealed the truth. This wasn't just a disagreement within the royal family. It was a battle for its soul, playing out in front of a global audience. With public outrage at its peak, it was no longer about private feuds. This was now a royal reckoning with one final act. She was the palace's backbone, the queen's shadow. And now, she is gone. As Windsor tries to carry on without her, one truth remains. Anne didn't just leave the palace. She left a wound the crown may never heal. In the aftermath of Camilla's disastrous speech and the public's explosive reaction, all eyes turned to Princess Anne. Yet she had already vanished from the spotlight. While royal commentators debated the monarchy's future, Anne quietly packed up what little remained of her official life and retreated to her private estate in Scotland. It wasn't an exile. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a departure made with clarity, conviction, and finality. She refused all remaining royal duties, turned down every invitation, declined to attend even the most symbolic engagements. For the first time since she was a child, Princess Anne had severed her formal tie to Windsor and made it clear there would be no return under current conditions. What followed was something no royal insider could have predicted: a tidal wave of public mourning. Tributes poured in not only from the British public, but from dignitaries, world leaders, and international organizations that had worked with Anne for decades. Her decades of service, once taken for granted in the background of more glamorous royals, were now being honored with the reverence they always deserved. Across the country, flags were lowered. Speeches were given. Memorials lit up in her name. Not for her death, but for her absence, for what her departure meant. Because the people knew what the palace had tried to deny. Something had been broken, and it might not ever be put back together. Behind palace doors, King Charles made a quiet pilgrimage to Anne's estate alone, without press or advisors. He arrived unannounced, and he left hours later, visibly weary and wordless. Whatever was said between the siblings remains shrouded in mystery, but one thing was confirmed by a royal aide close to Anne. There was no reconciliation, no apology, no resolution. Just a widening chasm between the monarch who carried the weight of the crown and the sister who carried the memory of their mother. The distance between them was no longer just physical. It was spiritual, philosophical, irreparable. Rumors swirled that Anne had delivered a final condition, that she would not return until Camilla issued a public apology. Not for the comment, not for the speech, but for the erosion of everything Queen Elizabeth had built. And yet, that apology never came. Camilla, now wounded and cornered, remained defiant. Her grip on influence weakened daily, yet her silence remained louder than any statement she could have made. Meanwhile, the royal family quietly splintered into factions. Some stood firmly behind Anne, honoring her principles, her loyalty, and her embodiment of tradition. Others clung to Camilla's modernizing vision, desperate to salvage what little control remained in an institution under siege from within. The palace remained silent, but Anne did not. In her final message, sent not through a press office but delivered via handwritten note to a former aide, she wrote just 8 words that now hang in the air like an epitaph for a crumbling monarchy. "My loyalty lies where honor lived. No further." As the dust settles, one thing is clear: This wasn't just a feud. It was the moment Windsor changed forever. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.